Okay, so we've been on a nearly 4-month detour from what's supposed to be our regularly scheduled sermon series. And so we're back to it after, as I say, nearly 4 months. And so here's a reminder. The idea is the Bible is not a book, it's a library. And in this library are many different kinds of books with many different kinds of writing. And each kind of literature has its own characteristics, of course. And like we just automatically do with different kinds of movies, we need to approach these various literary genres differently and appropriately if we're going to get out of them all the richness that's been put into them. And another important idea this year has been the idea of exegesis, which is a fancy-sounding word that just means that we start with not, what does this mean to me? But we start with, what did this mean then and there? How did this hit people then? And we start with that. It gets us out of ourselves. It decenters us from the conversation just a little bit and opens us up to the possibility of thinking something new. And we've done that sort of thing with various kinds of writing. So we have looked at what are called epistles, but are just letters. Remember that most of the New Testament, we're just reading somebody else's mail. We looked at a kind of writing called household codes that shows up once in a while in these letters. That was a kind of literature back then that taught especially Roman young men how to rule the household. It was like toxic masculinity concentrate. And what we see in the Bible is that it starts like that and then it detoxifies. We've looked at Old Testament narrative, which is just good old-fashioned storytelling. All during Advent, we looked at the genealogy that opens the Gospel of Matthew, and we followed the traces when there were 4 women mentioned in a genealogy that's not supposed to have women in it. Matthew's deliberately shocking his audience, and we've tried to follow why. We've looked at Gospels, we've looked at parables, and we've looked at the book of Acts, which is the only example of New Testament narrative. So this sermon, and the next sermon I give, whenever that is, it's a little unclear to me. But anyway, I just assume someone will tell me. But this one and the next one will be on the book of Psalms. And since the book of Psalms, it's huge, and it's had such a big influence on Christian practice and worship, I think that 2 sermons is at the very least we can do. So let's start by just talking about what the Psalms are. Now, some of us in this room, I'm not pointing fingers or anything, are old enough to remember buying records. My father used to say, you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, and the one that yelps is the one you hit. So thank you. So I mean vinyl records. I don't mean the recent trendy hipster vinyl. I mean records when that was your only choice. That was your main way to purchase and listen to music. And there were other forms, of course, that came and went, and some stayed around, like the long-lasting CD. But in all of these, one of the great pleasures in purchasing a new album, at least for me, was taking it home and studying the liner notes. Now, children, there was a time when liner notes were on a liner. There was a lot of space, so you could put a lot of words. Now it's in a CD, it's a booklet, but there were actual liners. But I'd ask myself, who's the drummer? Who's the drummer on this album? Is it a name I recognize? And sometimes it was. Is it someone I've met? One time it was. I was practically famous, right? Little kid. I know that guy. Who composed these songs? Who wrote the lyrics? And perhaps most importantly, what in the world are the lyrics? So written lyrics were maybe one of the most helpful and enlightening things on liner notes, because then you could actually try to figure out, you could actually follow along instead of working hard to say, what does mean? So, why am I talking about this? The question here is, what is a psalm? So imagine that you go out and you buy a record. It's a new album. is filled with new songs. You open it up, and joy of joy, the liner notes on the liner include all the lyrics. And you look through the lyrics and you think to yourself, wow, this is deep. This is beautiful. This is honest. This is raw. And then you go to play the music, and there's no record. There's no way to listen to the music at all. All you can do is read the lyrics. And that's what the Psalms are. They are songs. They are musical poems. That's a fancy term for it. But we don't have the music anymore. And to just stop and think about the extent of that loss. Think how much difference music makes in songs. Music can redeem repetition. I could stand here and I could say, Amen. 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 Let's say I do that about 80 times. You know, like 3-year-olds do when they want to know, what does a grown-up nervous breakdown actually look like? But when Handel sets that very repetition to music in the Messiah, we are deeply moved. The music takes that one word and carries us from introspection and humility to thankfulness, to remembrance of Christ's suffering, to awe in the presence of the endless glory of God. It's probably not what you would have gotten from my 80 spoken words. Or moving up to our own era. Here we go. I let out the sails of my heart. Oh. Here I am, here you are. I let out the sails of my heart. Oh. Here I am, here you are. It loses something, don't you think? And yet we know how powerful and beautiful that song is. The music is what makes such a huge difference. And not only this, but often music has a kind of a conversation with the lyrics. Sometimes through instrumental breaks, as we have heard this morning. You know, like wild harp and lyre solos. But sometimes it's more subtle. You're probably, I'm sure, familiar with the song, the old song, this is the day that the Lord has made. Yeah. Imagine those same lyrics set to minor music, in a minor key, to hesitant, depressing music. And then suddenly that song would take on a very different kind of depth, right? There'd be this tension between these simple, happy words and this profoundly melancholy music that could, in that conversation, remind us of the tension we often feel between what we believe, what we want to believe, but what we are actually feeling at that moment. There's a difference sometimes. And the point is, in all of this, wow, Paul, nice sermon on music appreciation. The point is that we have to remember how much we're missing when we look at the Psalms. We're missing all of that. And yet, the lyrics that remain are still beautiful, are still powerful. Unlike with a lot of other songs you might know. If you strip away the music, the lyrics don't work. But with the Psalms, they still do, which is pretty amazing. So we've lost the music, but the lyrics are still poetry. Poetry, which means they are by design emotional. And they were originally even more emotional when music was in the mix. They're filled with imagery and exaggeration and metaphor and just outbursts of emotion and raw honesty. And we're going to talk more about that sort of raw honesty in the next, whenever this is, the next sermon. But for today, we're just going to have one idea to grab onto, just one. And it's going to seem like a simple and obvious statement. Here it is. For each psalm, songwriter wrote a song. Wrote the whole song. The songwriter wanted us to hear and sing the whole song. Everything in these poems are meant to be in the poems. They're meant to be understood in the context of what else is in that poem. We don't, for example, parachute into that song Sails that I referred to earlier. We don't parachute in and just say this: I let out the sails, and stop, because we like that little phrase. No, there's a context, right? The music builds to that moment. That actually doesn't show up to about halfway through. And we've built to get there in that song. Just, I let out the sails is pretty meaningless. If I just kind of walk around downtown and say this to people, doesn't mean much. And in the same way, each poem in the Psalms hangs together, is meant to be heard together. In the original context, the congregations or the musicians didn't just stop playing halfway through. And unfortunately, we tend to ignore this. We tend to pop into a psalm, read the stuff we like, leave out the stuff we don't. Take Psalm 139, for example, and this is going to be our main focus this morning. Here's the stuff we liked. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. But in the same poem, here's the stuff we don't like. And I'll just say, often, like when there's like devotional readings to go through the Psalms every 15 minutes. You know, these kinds of programs people set out. Often these verses are left out. Like it doesn't just say Psalm 139, it says Psalm 39, 139, and it lists particular verses that obviously leaves stuff out. Here's what's left out typically. If only you would slay the wicked, O God. Away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent, God. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Huh? But the thing that I'm trying to say this morning is, it doesn't matter whether we like it or not. What matters is, if we're going to read respectfully and thoughtfully, we have to remember that the poet intended those two different passages to be in the same poem. And our job is to ask ourselves why, and to ask ourselves how they fit and work together. So I'm going to give you my thoughts this morning on how these passages from Psalm 139 do fit together. It's just a hypothesis. Please keep that in mind. Didn't have time this week to go back and interview the songwriter. Before I get to it, I just want to tell you that how clearly I remember the first time I proposed this idea that I'm about to present to you. I was in a smallish church on Galliano Island. I was invited as a guest preacher. And I was already, before the service began, a little wound up because this church, and again, much smaller than the place, this church had the regular habit of holding a talk-back discussion in the service right after the sermon, just a whole group discussion. And I had been warned that there were some in the congregation who really enjoyed the back part of talk back. And that confronting the preacher was sort of their reasonable service of worship. So, as I say, I was a little, wound up. But I had done my homework and I felt pretty confident and I was doing all right until the moment the service began, in walked Gordon Fee. So if you know, some of you are making noises like you know this name. So Gordon Fee, just recently deceased, was one of the most highly regarded biblical scholars of the late 20th century and even into the early 21st century. He had written all sorts of influential biblical commentaries, and for over 30 years, if you read the NIV, for over 30 years he was on the committee that regularly reviewed and revised the NIV. I was actually in a tiny little Bible study where somebody said, "Gordon, how do we make sense of this?" And he looked at, on one knee he had the Greek New Testament, and on the other knee he had the NIV, and he looked back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and he said, "Oh, that really doesn't capture the essence of it at all. I'm going to change that." And he got out this little notebook, and he wrote a little note to himself, so the next time the committee met, he was going to make a proposal. I was sitting next to the guy who was going to change the Bible. So he walks in, and I'm about to preach a sermon that he's going to listen to. So I was intimidated, but I also knew from reputation that he was also very kind and very gracious, and I hoped that was true. And then I had no choice but to begin. And I will tell you that what I had been told about the confrontation part of Talkback was true. The very moment my sermon was over, like the last word was still like echoing in the room. And someone in the congregation had a pressing question, but not for me, for Gordon Fee. And right there in front of God and everybody, the person said, "Gordon, is Paul right about this, or is he just making this up? Is this the right way to look at Psalm 139 or not?" I'll tell you Gordon Fee's answer later. So, back to the question. How can these different passages, this one is so cozy, right? You knit me together on a mother's womb, and the other one, I hate everybody. How can that work together? And the key, I think, is actually quite simple. And it is it's in words that appear before verse 1 even starts. All these psalms have little headings. And in this heading, there's for the director of music, and then there's helpfully this phrase, a psalm. Oh. But there's also of David. And it turns out that that phrase might mean that David wrote the psalm, or it might mean that it was written about King David, or it might mean that it was written by someone else as if it were written by King David. It's vague in the Hebrew, but the point is we're supposed to think about King David, and we're supposed to think about his life. We're supposed to think about the world through King David's perspective as we enter into this poem. And we know a lot about David's life. And one of the things that we can easily pick up from in his life is that over and over again, as a result of believing in God and following God and being obedient to God, David found himself in conflict with people he loved. His older brother got really angry with him when David started to ask why nobody was fighting Goliath. Later, King Saul was intensely jealous of David to the point that he tried to kill him. And much later, David's own son Absalom began a civil war against King David. And in all these situations, David faced what we all hope we never have to, but we sometimes do. Choosing between loyalty to God or loyalty to people we love. It's a horrible situation. I think especially about how reluctant David was to enter into that civil war against his own son, Absalom. He knew the struggle would tear his family apart. But he also knew that he had been called by God to be king, and Absalom had not. David's duty as a follower of God was to be king. But he also had a duty as father to protect his family. And because of the situation he found himself in, it was impossible to completely fulfill both those duties. Again, he had to choose between loyalty to God and loyalty to family, which is horrible and stressful and just creates so much anxiety. I think we've all felt this to a much lesser degree, that horrible feeling you get when you realize, oh, there's no good choice available to me right now. And that's where David was, but times many. And that, I'm proposing, is the context of Psalm 139. I believe he wrote this psalm just before deciding that he would struggle against his own son in a civil war. Or maybe David wrote this psalm later to capture the emotions of that moment, looking back. Or maybe somebody else wrote it about David's tortured emotions when he was faced with this impossible choice. So, whatever the case, we can still keep that context in mind, and I'm about to read Psalm 139 aloud, and I'll just explain how I think it works. But before I do, I want to point out that this psalm has three obvious different sections. The first section is the longest, and it's the nice stuff. It's David reminding himself just how big God is. And I'm proposing that David is doing this laundry list of how amazing God is, in order to get up the nerve to proclaim his loyalty to God over his own flesh and blood. You're so great, you're so great, you're so great. That's why I'm choosing you, like that sort of thing. But it wasn't too far underneath the surface that David, he doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to choose God over family. And so this bigness of God, this overwhelming importance and presence and power of God, is actually kind of claustrophobic to David. We'll find as I read it that nice part actually has some ominous negativity to it. Like, God, you're so great, you're everywhere. That sort of, oh no. In the second section, after all that build-up, David makes his decision and proclaims his decision for God very emotionally. You know this feeling too, probably. David knew all along what the right choice was, but didn't want to make it. And had to gear himself up to make the right choice. But it had been bottled up, and I think you know this too. The decision had been bottled up because he was trying to not make it, so that when it did come out, it came out with a lot of what I'm going to call emotional velocity. And then in the third section, which is the shortest, David's in a state of shock. And he's trying to recover from this proclamation, and he wonders, as so many of us do, after a strong emotional outburst, he wonders whether he did the right thing, whether he said the right thing. So here we go. Here's the first section. It's the longest, and remember, this is David reminding himself about the almost claustrophobic bigness of God. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. You hem me in. Behind. Before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn and settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame wasn't hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. That's the first section. And now, after all that build-up, here comes David's decision, a decision for God that is by necessity also against some in his family. And before I read it, a brief but very important note on the word hate in this passage. This is a typical and usually inadequate English translation of a Hebrew word that means a lot more than just hate or despise. The Hebrew word often means something like, we don't have a word for this. I reject your worldview and your way of living life. I cannot and will not abide your principles or priorities. So I reject you and your way of thinking and your way of living. It's not a mean-spirited, I hate you. It's I reject your whole grid for thinking and how you approach life. And that's why this proclamation is so painful for David. Okay, here we go. The second section. David makes his decision. If only you would slay the wicked, O God. Away from me, you bloodthirsty man. They speak of you with evil intent, God. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. As Gordon Fee himself, in one of his many books, put it about this particular moment, the poet here is expressing in the strongest possible way his utter dismay and his inability to put up with those who have rejected God. And again, this is why all of it is so difficult and emotional for David, because those God haters were not way out there somewhere waiting to be othered. These were David's own family. And finally, after that emotional outburst, there's a third and a very short, I hope I did the right thing, section. Search me, O God. Know my heart. Test me. Know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. That's the psalm. So again, if I'm right about the Absalom civil war context, or at least if the shape of my idea is right, I want you to notice a couple of things. First, notice that the emotions involved are so human, so honest, so raw. And again, I'll have more to say about that next time. But notice also that, again, if I'm right, those very verses that we want to leave out, they're actually the climax of the poem. They're actually the point. They're the reason for the build-up and the reason for the anxiety afterwards. So, back to Galliano Island and Gordon Fee. Gordon, is Paul right, or is he just making this stuff up? And here's what that gracious man, Gordon Fee, said. Paul may in fact be right, he said. Even though, as he says, nobody can know for sure. But then he said this, which was so helpful, encouraging. But even if Paul is wrong, his idea has the right shape. And he said to the whole congregation, a psalm must be approached as a literary unit, as one thing that holds together. And our job is to try to find out how. So it was very nice of him. So, I've made that point. Trying to think about each psalm as a literary unit. It's actually a really neat way to approach a psalm and have your mind very active and engaged. Trying to figure it out. Enter into the world. Make it work together. Especially when it doesn't seem like it does. Then it's a wonderful challenge. But, and that's all really I want to say, but I feel bad for King David. We've left him in a bad place. So let's end with one other complete psalm. It's very short. It's also of David. And this one obviously holds together. There's no work that needs to be done. And this one leaves David in a better emotional space. And I think, even though it's 133, so numerically it comes before, it makes a lot more sense that this comes after, when David, just like we heard in the community prayer, realizes what he had now that he'd lost it. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It's like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down upon the collar of his robes. It is as if dew from the highest peaks were falling on Mount Zion. For there the Lord bestows blessing, even life evermore. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. Amen to that.